Welcome to anyone watching, it's Craig at mysimpit.co.uk and welcome to part 28 of the front dash build. In this video we'll take a step back and look at the project so far and revisit what was the original scope of the project. We'll then take some time to look at the panels that have been designed, built, installed and completed to this point and consider them in terms of what was originally envisioned. And then we can then finally look to touch on the panels that are remaining and finish by looking at the Simpit and the front dash in use. Let's buckle up. So in this video we're looking to take a step back and have a look at the front dash project to this point. It's a good time to do that because with the HSI and ADI upcoming, separate to in whatever way I do replicate those, it is going to take a bit of time to look into them just from a research point of view. So I thought it would be a good time to reflect on the project as it is to this point, to revisit what was the original scope of that project, to take a look at this whole thing in operation, perhaps have a bit of time to reflect on some of the instruments I've had installed, how they're fared to this point in use whenever I'm flying, and then also to talk through the remaining parts that will complete it. For anyone new to the channel and maybe they've not heard the term Simpit before, what we mean by that is we're building a physical cockpit environment, and in this case I've chosen to do it for the A10C Warthog, and that's for interfacing to DCS, Digital Combat Simulator. The project will be made up of 3 parts. The first part that we can see here that's been completed and installed for some time is the full left console. And I have to say that has served me very well, and it'd be difficult to imagine flying without that now. The current phase of the overall project we're on is the front dash, and then finally in this sort of space here we'll finish with the right console, and then most likely there'll be some work done around an ejection seat. In terms of other general additions to the Simpit, something that I've added fairly recently to give a bit more feedback from the sim and a bit more immersion is on the underneath of this. Well, this is a temporary measure. It's an old office chair that I've just done a cutout here so it can be moved right up against the flight control stick. But what I have added to it, if we'll just take a look at the underneath, is I've added a tactile transducer, and that is connected to the amplifier that we can see just over there. And this is often also known as a bass shaker. And what that means is it will allow me to output from the simulator, from the aircraft, the certain vibrations that you'll get, and you get to feel those through the chair. So I have to say, with flying with this, you get to feel things like when you're flying down the runway, you get to feel all that vibration passing through into the chair. Things like retracting and extending the undercarriage, you get to feel even the clunk of the wheels in place, and even small things like the flaps moving across the surface of the wings, you get to feel those pass through the chair as well. So a really good addition to just make it that one more step immersive. So what we'll look to do is we'll look to fire this up now, and then we can have a look and reflect on how it's working to this point. So upon startup, I would initialize the track IR. Tends to be one of the first things I do. It just takes a split second. And if we just go into the settings here, we can get an idea of the peripherals that we have attached. So we have 3 keyboard encoders, this main TV as a monitor, 3 further monitors attached, which in this case are going to be the 2 MFCDs and the RWR. We've got a USB audio device, so it's a USB sound card, and that's what drives the bass shaker. We've got 5 Arduinos at the moment across these COM ports here, and then you've got the rudder pedals, the HOTA system, and as we just said, the track IR. If we also go and have a look at the display settings, you can get a bit of an idea of what's set up where. So in terms of the original scope of the project, and we'll just zoom in to have a look at this, the idea was to build what we see on screen here. Everything below the brow of the front dash would be fully completed, everything downwards of that. And then above it, we were going to finish with the upfront controller, and then to the side of it you had the glide slope LEDs, or annunciators, and then you had the same equivalent for the aerial refueling, and that was it. It wasn't in my original plan to make a heads-up display. I have wondered now whether to potentially have one as a placeholder. I think it would be good to visually have something there, although the big thing for me was to ensure that it doesn't impede my view of the sim or interfere in any way. I'll follow a startup sequence electronically to bring the Simpit online, and then once it's all launched and powered up, I then look to begin the data stream. So I have another little checklist for that, and I like to bring them on line one at a time, just so I can see that they're all operating correctly. Into the future I'll just have one command I'll run, it'll launch them all, but at the moment I've got the 5 Arduinos we see here on these COM ports, and we'll now launch them one at a time. So the first one's COM3, and that's one of 2 RS485 networks I've got on here currently. The second one's dedicated to the EMI. The first one runs a number of instruments and panels within this. Let's have a look at that one. We can see a number of panels launch there. The next one is the EMI network. Now this one's going to bring online most of the left console. There's not really much to see because this controls like the potentiometers and some of the inputs. But what we are going to look at now is the radio stack. As I launch that one there, and then finally we've got one of the Arduino Mega running over IRQ serial. And you could probably hear the coil of the anti-skid magnetically held switch engaged then. The first panel to look at is the landing gear panel. This was one that was a lot of fun to build, more than anything because it had such a mix of different components within it. It was really good to incorporate a magnetically held switch, and it was the first one that I'd used in a Simpit to that point. Also to source and install a genuine original Tornado landing gear lever, which I was able to salvage a number of the original bulbs too, so when that illuminates when the wheels are in transit, it gives a good effect. I 3D printed this cap for the toggle, so the landing lights toggle is, the look of it's in keeping with that of the Sim. And then in terms of the annunciator lights for each of the wheels, I'd kept in mind some of the work I'd done on the left console, and I did feel that they didn't necessarily look the best without a bezel around, and I never felt that the amount of backlighting was as bright as I would like. And if I do let's hold down the signal lights lamp test, you can see that there. And if I go to the trim panel, and I mean ultimately it's bright enough to see it and to know what's going on there, but I did make a point of when I came to do the front dash, as you can say, for the steering engaged annunciator and these ones for the wheels, definitely brighter now, and it gives a better effect. And then to just make sure that I'd put a bezel around it, and we also had a bezel around the flaps indicator too. So on the whole, really happy with that panel. I can't really think of anything I would go back and change or upgrade to it. The next panel's the armament hood control panel, and for this one I'd always had it in mind to use some genuine aircraft parts, and all of these are sourced from Tornadoes. I had a number of panels I sourced online, some of which were quite badly damaged, but I was able to strip them down and put these in place. There was a bit of a concern initially about, because there's a lot more force needed to actuate them, whether that would there be a risk of actually cracking or damaging the acrylic fascia. Of the ones I had, I picked the ones that had the least force to actuate, but it did fare well, and once this was secured in place to the frame of the front dash, it held it securely enough that it wasn't an issue, so that's been fine. I did have one for the nav panel, that one like this one here, and I put it here for the able stow position of one of the navigation bars. It really did not work, it literally felt like you was pulling the whole panel off. So, but for this panel here, they did work well. They've got a really good feel to them. They were manufactured by Lucas Aerospace, and I believe they were Coventry based, but it just oozes quality, so it's really, really nice to be able to use these. For the digital clock, it's functional. I would say that it fulfills the purpose. I can't really get excited about that one. I think it only does the job of just displaying the information of the time and the timer. I do plan maybe to go back at some point as part of an upgrade and to really produce something a lot more in line with the Sim. But with that one, there were some really positive learnings, particularly around the usage of OLEDs and how to create a splash screen and how to have several items of the outputted code displayed as values on the screen, all at the same time, and they update independently but without affecting the display overall. So some good learnings, but as I say, that's one, it's very functional. I would plan to revisit. Angle of attack indicator, nice and straightforward, works well. A standard X27 stepper. The UHF repeater, on reflection, I would have liked to have used a 7-segment display in white. I think that would give a better look. But the OLED display is crisp and clear, and it fulfilled its purpose. And then we've got the standby attitude indicator, and this one for me is one that I really, really enjoy flying with. I think relative to its size in the footprint of the front dash, this one probably took one of the greatest amounts of time to make relative to the size, but the effect of flying with it, where you've got an axis rotating within an axis, is to great effect. I think the only thing I would possibly change on there is the linear actuator at some point, just because there's a bit of chatter on it. Other than that, really pleased with that one. For the top left quadrant of the front dash, my most recent addition is the airspeed indicator, and I'm happy with that from an aesthetical point of view. I think it looks fine. In terms of the functionality, the decimals rotary is fine. The mechanism mechanically looks to work well and reliably. The X40 stepper, relative to the scale of the outside marker lines, I may revisit that in the future. So the jury's out on this one ultimately. I think I'm going to fly with it for a while, and that may well be an upgrade in the future, and to revisit that. What we then have is the RWR, and I did ponder for quite some time the best way to do this. Ultimately, a monitor export is what made sense and is what I went with, but it was about getting something that was small enough, something that was literally under 4 inches as a screen. I did source one. The one I got goes through an AV converter, so there's an extra few bits of equipment at the back of it, but if anyone's building this one, I'd suggest, if you can, you get a 3.5 inch screen which has a standard VGA connection, just for simplicity. And then we have the MFCD, and the MFCD was one of the more initial panels I did for the front dash, and took quite a considerable amount of time, and it's because there was just so many learnings and the learning curve in approaching it. So this was one of the first things I printed on my 3D printer, and it's one of the most substantial things I've printed as a full enclosure. So there was the time that was taken to source my 3D printer, because I knew I would need one, to set it up, to learn how to use Fusion 360 to design this, to then 3D print it, and then the whole part of how do you do post-print work, and just getting a bit of familiarity with some of the epoxy resins, and just sort of sanding it and priming it and then painting it and giving it a good finish. So a lot of learnings on that one, but it did take some time. I also incorporated PCBs in there, so there was a time taken to learn how to use that software. But I think from the insides of this and keeping the wiring manageable, I think the PCBs definitely were definitely a good touch to that one there. And then for these caps, and this is probably the one aspect of it, is the only real aspect I would change, is these caps. The white PLA 3D printed to fit on or click onto a illuminated tactile, and I made a jig which could hold these in place whilst they were CNC machined. But I think the thickness of the paint and the uneven surface of the PLA meant that the engraving was not as crisp as I would like. So whilst it's sufficient, that is something for the future. Maybe when I do the upfront controller, and I like these tactiles, I certainly intend to use them again. I'm going to modify my approach and try and give a crisper finish to these. And then we have some of the annunciator lights, and as I've commented for the landing gear panel here, it was always my intention to make sure that compared to the left console that they were better backlit, that there was a stronger degree of backlighting. These have the front bezel around them. They also have their own 3D printed enclosure at the back to ensure that the light from the little LED at the back is contained, so there's no bleed if it's, say, from this window to that window. In terms of how I envisioned this quadrant from the outset of the project, the MFCD is to the standard I had in mind, with the exception of the engraving, but everything else is as I hoped it would be in terms of the effect and the functionality and the aesthetic. One of the things I was pleased I was able to overcome was I always knew that this one would have quite a thick profile to it. It actually extends right through this 18mm piece of plywood and out the back, and I didn't want it just to be mounted on the front and it was out of place and looked odd relative to the other instruments. So whereas all the other ones are installed from the front of the dash, this one is actually installed from the back, and that means a lot of this profile is housed within here, which when I look back at that now, because I was unsure how I was going to achieve that, I'm pleased with the final finish and the way it's profiled. The RWR, very happy with that. I think that looks really smart. This one, as I envisioned, I always said at the outset, I felt that there's quite a piece of work to this one. I think now, further down the line, I've had time to use dual concentric stepper motors, had time to use some of the NEMA 8, zero detection, and to play around with the sketches. And I think by the time I arrived at building this, I was so much more comfortable with what I was doing, and it seemed a lot clearer. So that wasn't as problematic as what I envisioned. And with these enunciators, this is pretty much how I imagined it. It's quite a simple affair really. So the key thing was I wanted a good amount of light without it bleeding from one to the other. Looking at the centre line downwards for the front dash, what we've got down here is a circuit breaker panel, and there's quite a lot of work that went into there. At this point it acts and sits there just as a placeholder, but all of these fuses that you see here, which are 3D printed, and there's some acrylic of CNC engraved, are attached to some PCBs. I've designed some circuitry inside. It's all ready to be connected, and these will illuminate red. So at some point there will be an exercise I'll undertake to connect this up, and then should a fuse be tripped in the sim, it will be illuminated here and you can reset it from there. The Tissel panel, that's one which isn't functional in the sim. I've put it in as a placeholder. I think with some of the upgrades coming to the A10 in DCS, it might be that's just something that gets taken away completely, or it might be something I bring online later. We'll see on that one. We've got the nav panel, which is primarily made up of some of these simple buttons that are sourced online. They've got a good feeling to them. To put the text behind, I'd printed onto acetate, and that worked well for me. I did try things with prints on paper, did not look good. The bleed through the light against the black part of the image did not look good, but this gave a much better effect. And then what we've got is the CMSC panel, and I think with this one, in terms of things I would change, these buttons here and here, whilst they look perfectly fine and they've got a good feeling to them to click and use, they're not in keeping with the sim. Something like this would be more in keeping. So that would be the only bit of this I would change. For the other bits, really like the vacuum filled display, really like that, to the point that that would definitely be used in the countermeasures panel in the right console. And then some other touches, like I had some of these cheap knobs I got online, and they do look a bit like hi-fi knobs, so I just sort of shorten the profile of them and clean them up and sprayed them like more of a matte black to give it a bit more of a military finish. But on the whole, happy with that outcome there. For this whole centre line, compared to how I pictured it at the beginning of the project, I'd always picture these as placeholders, so I'm very pleased with these, and I'm particularly pleased with the circuit breaker panel because I took it several steps further than what I'd initially had in my mind when I outlined the scope of the project. Definitely happy with the CMSC and the display in it. Nav panel works well, and what it really brings us to is the two remaining large gaping holes in the fascia, which are going to be for the HSI and the ADI. Now, when I did the first video of the series, I talked about with these most likely looking at an exported view in Helios, but what I've decided to do is to explore that and a couple of other options too, and go into a bit of a research phase, and at the end of which I'll know which I'll take forward. The options are put a monitor in and use Helios, to get a real instrument and look to adapt it, or to build it myself, or to maybe build it myself and take several original parts from a genuine HSI or ADI. So what I'll be doing now is taking some time to explore all three of those options, so whichever one I go forward with, I know by the fact I've explored all of them is definitely the right one for me. The first one, which would be a potential monitor export, from when I did the MFCDs, I've got another monitor I sourced at the time, which is another frameless monitor that would fit this quite well. It's pretty much exactly the right height to cover both the ADI and the HSI, and probably a fraction, I would say maybe a millimetre or two too wide, but I could find a way to mount it into there. And I will bring that online. I'll run Helios on it and I'll see what it looks like. The other thing will be probably to pick up some kind of a HSI instrument off eBay, something that's used, and probably strip it down, have a good look at it, understand how it works as best as I can, and just make a judgment on how easily I could convert that, or what parts are salvageable to take across to something I would build. And then the last option would be to start to put together and play around with some of the mechanics of that would be involved should I do it myself. So probably will take a little bit of time to work through that, but then I'll be clear about which will be the right way forward. For the top right quadrant, I'll begin with the MFCD because it's literally a mirror of the one on the left, so everything we say applies there, and the same with the canopy and marker beacon enunciators. The vertical velocity indicator, now for that one I use an X27 stepper. I did alter the scale slightly, which kind of links with this one here. This one I did alter the scale slightly and it works satisfactorily. I wouldn't say it can run at the speed that the actual VVI does in the sim, but given the nature of this instrument it works just fine. It might be an option at some point to come back and maybe stick like something a bit quicker in like an EMA 8 and that'll have a full range, but I'll consider that for the future. But on the whole, that one's fine. The altimeter, really happy with that one. This one did take a fair bit of time to get everything in place. I would say there is a fair bit to that one, and it was one of the first ones where I'd use an EMA 8 because I needed something that could run that much quicker. So very happy with this quadrant of the front dash, and a particular highlight for me is the altimeter. I mean, whilst I did use a little bit of artistic license with the layout, I think when I fly, it's one of those, it's when you fly with it and perhaps you've got big changes in altitude and it's running at speed, and the display of the OLED and everything, that one for me does jump out. I really do think that's a good addition to the Simpit. For the bottom right quadrant, it's made up really of just two parts. You've got the fuel quantity and hydraulic panel, and happy with that one on the whole. The hydraulic gauges, really happy with the work I did around using or producing a geared servo unit. So first time I designed and printed and made my own gears, and it really did make the mechanism of the hydraulics, the way they move, mirror quite closely what happens in the sim. So very pleased with that one there and its usage. I've got a real knob off a Tornado there which will allow me to, I need to tidy it up, but it will allow me to illuminate the marker line there. And it was the first one, first panel where I'd use a dual concentric stepper, and that does work really well. The only thing I would say in terms of a learning on that one is that that stepper I used got so much, or it got so battered after all the many tests and installing it and tweaking it, and at the very end when I was ready to pop it in, I should have just put a brand new one in, because it does run, you can tell it's a little bit worn. So at some point it's a bit worse for wear. I probably will go back and change that stepper. And the final part of this quadrant's the EMI, engine monitoring instruments. This is a second version I did of it. The first version I've actually got over here on the windowsill, and this was a test bed, and it allowed me to understand how I could get a cluster of so many X27s to run and how I would build something like this. But I really felt that I wanted to take it to the point where I could have these coloured bezels, and from a maintenance point of view as well, these pointers on the other one they were glued on, whereas on this they're actually attached to the shaft via a bit of hollow tubing that I've just pinched the end. And that does mean from a maintenance point of view it's better, although ironically in terms of this panel, this one here for the fuel flow, you can see there's a little bit of needle slip, and ironically if I'd have glued it on I wouldn't have had that problem. So by giving it ease of maintenance is the very reason I now need to do some maintenance. But I do think ideally don't glue where you don't need to. Also as well, this one is running on its own dedicated RS485 network. And that's where it brings me to this point where you can see there's some boxes down here, and for each of the two RS485 networks I've got a monitoring instrument for them, so I can just monitor it in terms of power consumption, It gives all kinds of readouts for that, so just lets me, I'm always very interested to know the power consumption, and I think of that in terms of the PCBs I've designed and what would be appropriate to drive through those. But it's always not a nice touch to have those. Perhaps when I've got the right console in down here, I might relocate them or find a different way to access them. So we've just spent some time working our way through all of the panels as built and installed into the front dash, and to reflect back to the original scope that we outlined and how it compares to that. And I think at this point in thinking about the project as a whole, and in terms of what adds to the enjoyment of flying, I think I couldn't just say which or doesn't, because they'd all be on they all add list. But I do think that in terms of perhaps some kind of order of what complements flying the greatest, which adds the most effect, I would start with the landing gear panel, then onto the standby attitude indicator, the altimeter, the MFCDs, and then the EMI, and then everything else would sort of fall behind that. But yeah, and that's not so much in terms of aesthetics on its own or functionality on its own. It's kind of wrapping all of that together in just the enjoyment of using it in flight and what I feel it adds when I'm utilising it. Let's get this kite spin to the big blue. That never gets old. I have to say, it really does never get old. So we're 18 months into the project of building the front dash. Happy with the progress overall. It was never something I wanted to rush. If it was a case it took another 18 months to finish it, that'd be fine. I am conscious that some of the panels I've got upcoming, dependent on the way I produce them, could take a lot of time, sort of proportionally to what the others took. But it'd be interesting to enter a bit of a research phase now and decide the way forward with those. I look forward to sharing the progress of some of the bigger panels into the future. Thanks for watching.